I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the smarter, safer, cleaner truck initiative that you announced this morning, and in particular whether this is a sort of initiative that could be rolled out in other industries.
Thanks, Patrick. I won't take a lot of time because we need to hear from others as well. Look, I mentioned it earlier. It's one of those no-brainers that people say, why didn't they do it before? We've got the biggest infrastructure build in the country at the moment, and part of that build is the price of progress. The trucks that Dennis Cleish's group do, building West Connects or Scott's over in North Connects, those trucks are helping part of the congestion in the city, the amount of truck movements that we're doing. And we were looking at a way to lessen the amount of movements. And suddenly, talking to industry, it's in the productivity. If we can put 20% more on a vehicle, provided they're safer, they're cleaner, they have the ability to monitor the load, to go straight back to RMS to know if they're breaching load, better axle combinations that are safer on our roads, cleaner for the environment, Euro 5 or Euro 6, we've got a deal. We've got a 20% increase in production, a 20% reduction in trucks on our roads. That's 1,000 truck movements a week on government projects in Sydney, Newcastle and Wollongong. That's a good gain. Probably $100,000 for the operator, people buying new equipment, people building new equipment, better equipment going back through the chain into the second-hand market, safer vehicles around, visibly no different, with new abilities to be able to see pedestrians. It's a win-win. And if they've got the potential to net $100,000, over the period, we've got the potential to lower the costs of the building of the infrastructure. So it's one of those great ideas, and it was one of those things that came to industry to us. It took us 18 months to go through it, to get it right and to make it safe. So actually these trucks will be better trucks with the community. There'll be just less of them. So when you're fighting with trucks on Parramatta Road or Pennant Hills Road with the construction, you will know that in the next few years, and because we've got this chain of work happening in Sydney, people will be more inclined to make that investment because they can see that there's work happening in the future.
I wonder, it seems to me that this is an example of the need to focus on, in the infrastructure world, just not only the big projects but also the very small elements of it to find what productivity gains there are. But in the middle, there's initiatives like Fixing Country Rail, which is a $15 million scheme which you have going, and I understand has a $400 million future uplift behind it. I was wondering if you could tell the audience a little bit about that scheme as well.
Yeah, thanks. It's a bit like the Fixing Country Roads, where we're doing the last mile stuff, the missing links, and it's done on productivity. I don't make the decision where the money gets spent on fixing country roads. I'd love to every now and again to do an odd bit of pork barrelling, but the beauty of the scheme is, it's always a temptation, the beauty of the scheme, it is where it works and where it helps the supply chain. And the same will be in Fixing Country Rail. This is money that we were able to talk the Premier and the Treasurer into providing for us as part of the leasing of poles and wires, and it'll be used to put those passing links in, upgrade certain lines to provide, there are missing links within the state rail sector to provide those missing links into various ports. As I wander around, particularly heading into the Port of Newcastle from the northern region, there's some links that are missing through there. It will be helpful in that. And that's basically what we're doing. We'll also go back. I'm hopeful that there will be suggestions that come in because we've asked for ideas on the closed lines. If we were to put some money with some of the closed lines and things that aren't happening. There's Cowra, Dumondrel, Morden, Dumbarton and others. We are now in a position, which we weren't before, to be able to say, well, there is some government money, it's limited, but if you've got a plan, bring it to us and we'll see how it goes.
Thank you. That's probably a good segue to John. John, ARTC is seeking to make rail transport the mode of choice in Australia and deliver reliable and competitive services. What are the challenges that you're facing in that space?
Thanks, Patrick. Well, I know one challenge we don't face is convincing the general community that we need to move more freight by rail. I think we all know that it can improve road congestion and safety, and it provides a lot of environmental benefits. So that's certainly not one of our challenges, and less so today after the Minister admitted that he's a train spotter himself, or would like to become one. But
I've got the ad.
but look, I think the real challenge for rail really is how can we more integrate it into supply chains. I think we do, over time, we've improved our roads, we've improved our rail connections into ports, all those types of things. But until you really make rail better integrated into supply chains, I think we won't be able to achieve that vision that we have set ourselves as an organisation. And I think for a moment about a lot of rail terminals that we've got in place in our major capital cities today, that they've been there for 50 or 60 years. They're becoming inner city, so to speak, and it's often hard for emerging freight precincts on outer areas of big cities to be able to get onto that rail network because of they're competing with the general public on those road systems to get into those freight terminals. So, I certainly think that, any future freight precincts that are developed really have to provide good access to road and rail, so we can avoid those problems on our road networks. And it's probably why we see Moorebank being such an important development here in Sydney, for that very reason that you've got good road network, a good rail network, you've got sufficient space to build warehousing and distribution centres that in combination they will deliver huge benefits to the economics, I believe, of a capital city. And there should be more Moorebanks. I mean, I think more of those Moorebank terminals should be built around the country to service the major capital cities. I do think that when large freight precincts are planned in capital cities, that they should always provide for corridors that can be utilised by rail and also by the road network. And again, here in Sydney, building ultimately a terminal at Eastern Creek in the eastern and the western parts of Sydney is absolutely critical to be able to get the best combination of road versus rail, so that each mode does what it's good at. And I think that will provide huge benefits, not just to the major capital cities, but certainly for national productivity. And that's where I think rail's biggest challenge is. And it's important that companies like ourselves work very closely with state governments and with the federal government and with all the users of rail, whether the above rail operators, the freight forwarders, the end users, to make sure that those sorts of things become part of the logistics landscape for this country. Thank you, Patrick.
I can't resist asking a follow-up question about how you see yourself integrating the rail freight task with the land use planning processes in the various states at the moment.
Look, I just think it's all about, excuse me, it's all about getting momentum with all the people who are involved. And I think, you mentioned a bit earlier that I chair the Freight on Rail group, which I like to class as the G7 of rail, which are the major freight carriers around the country, a number in this room here today. I think it's a matter of marshalling the forces of that group. It's associations like the ALC, and it's good to see there's Ian and Michael here today from the ALC, the Australian Rail Association, and also working with each of the states who themselves have, freight strategies that they're developing, and to work very closely with them to make sure that, the strategy of business in terms of those that move freight is very fully aligned with, government ambitions and aspirations. And I think that's where I see there's been a lot of progress made over the last 5 years in getting all those players coming together. And I think it's best also represented now in organisations like Infrastructure Australia that are developing, 15-year infrastructure plans, very much focused on how do we improve national supply chains, because, look, at the end of the day, it's going to make the nation more productive, it's going to utilise the best mode of transport for the best load, and that carries with it, greater efficiencies and productivity.
Thank you. Kerry, no pressure, but John's told us that everything turns on the Moorebank Intermodal Terminal. I wonder if you can give us an update on the approval process and the timeline for delivery and operation of the terminal.
Thanks for that, Patrick. I've just been debating about whether to have a spray about planning approvals or not.
Go on.
But I won't. Where we're at is we are expecting planning approval shortly, and I might say the Planning Assessment Commission started work in December and we're still waiting. But what we are expecting is that we'll be starting construction on site in July. There's early works going on of the investigation, design and planning variety, and we are on track to have initial IMEX operations, the start of the Port Botany shuttle by early 2018, and the interstate operations will be ready about late 2019, maybe early 2020. So while we have been experiencing a bit of a delay, we are anticipating that we will catch up. John, I should just say that ARTC are just critical for us, and it's very good hearing the strong support that we have. The intermodal is critical, and the planning around it for roads and rail are, of course, essential. Those of you who may not be familiar with Moorebank, it's a very large site, and it's an excellent site because of its proximity to the Southern Sydney Freight Line and also to the M5 and the M7. Local road connections need to be improved so we can utilise those well, but it's also a great site because it'll allow us to have about 850 square metres of warehousing. And that means that end-to-end logistics, particularly for imports coming through, becomes a very possible reality. And I think when we're discussing freight, we really need to keep our eye on what it costs, because it's extraordinarily costly for agricultural produce to move at the moment, and also for anybody importing or trying to export something. So we really need to get our chain right and get the costs down.
Thank you. And costs probably quite a good place to shift to a user of the freight systems. Chris, from a user's perspective, a lot of your business is road-based, particularly in the eastern states. So what are the barriers for shifting onto the rail freight?
Yeah. Look, we'd love to use more rail. We've got hundreds of trucks across the East Coast every day. Actually, the vast majority of our surface freight from east to west is on rail already, and we'd like to do that on the East Coast, but simply the service and the cost that you can get out of rail between Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane is just doesn't make it worthwhile. So our customers require us to give them an overnight delivery service. So we may go to a retailer's distribution centre this afternoon. They'll expect that product on their shelves tomorrow across the eastern seaboard. So to use rail, our main depot out at Minchinbury, we'd have to get the product back there. Then we'd have to process it, load it into a rail container, take it to Chullora by 6 o'clock in the evening. And then it'll be available in Melbourne or Brisbane on Wednesday. So simply, it doesn't make sense from a service perspective, and also with all that extra work that has to be done, it's actually not cost effective either. So it would cost us about the same to take a rail container as it would to take a B double on one of those sectors, and yet we'd probably get double the freight in a B double than we would in a rail car. So it gets back to what you said before, John, about the integration into the road network. If we could make that a bit simpler, and if we could deliver that overnight, we'd be a big user of rail.
Thanks, Chris. John, that might be a good segue back to you. I wonder if you could give us an update on how you're seeing the Inland Rail project and what the economic benefits are of the connection between Melbourne and Brisbane, bearing in mind that we're in New South Wales and we're parochial. What are the benefits for regional New South Wales?
Thanks, Patrick. And Chris, that wasn't Dorothy Dick's question, really, to lead into Inland Rail. But yeah, you often talk about Inland Rail, and there's one thing that I don't describe the project as being an iconic or a nation-building project, because I think that that term is used far too extensively for projects of this magnitude. I see Inland Rail just really an extension of what is the rail network, and it's an important extension to extend the benefits of an efficient rail connection to all those eastern seaboard capital cities. And because on the eastern seaboard we do need to provide better services, as Chris was alluding to, we need to provide more capacity, we need to make a rail more viable. And that's the major driver for the Inland Rail project. And if there's any students of history in the room here today, next year actually is the 100-year anniversary of the Transcontinental Railway between Sydney and Perth. And for decades now, that railway has been operating world-class configuration trains. I'm talking about 1.8 kilometres long, 7 metres high, double stack. And importantly, those trains operate over about 60 hours, which is about equivalent to the road transit time. So it comes as no surprise that rail has for decades enjoyed about an 80% market share on that corridor because of those characteristics. And all we're simply saying with Inland Rail is that, you know, to support the demand for freight in the future, and given that the eastern seaboard is probably the fastest growing population region of Australia, particularly here in New South Wales, Minister, that I think it is important that we do provide a world-class rail connection, and that's what Inland Rail will deliver. It will deliver transit times equivalent to road. It'll allow trains to run at 1.8 kilometres long, double stacked along that eastern seaboard. And you know, for Australia to prosper in the future, it needs a world-class rail system running on the north-south corridor as much as it does on the east-west corridor. I think one of the other benefits I see from Inland Rail really is here in New South Wales. You know, Inland Rail, by chance, actually also runs through some of the richest farming regions in Australia, through the Moree, Dubbo area, and then in the Darling Downs there in Queensland. And for decades now, those areas have been serviced by, you know, old railway systems that have served their use-by date. And what Inland Rail does provide is to be able to operate longer, more efficient trains, higher axle load trains servicing many of the ports here in New South Wales, whether it's Port Botany, whether it's Newcastle, whether it's Port Kembla. It provides an important backbone through those agricultural areas to deliver export products cheaper into the global market. So I think there is a lot of winners with Inland Rail, and it provides a great alternative to moving freight more efficiently. We know, I think the industry tells us, that the coastal route that carries freight across Melbourne, Sydney to Brisbane in 31 hours is just not road competitive. We have to get that down to 24 hours to be road competitive, otherwise nobody will be using rail into the future. So unless it's done, we would look, or there would be a need probably to spend more and more funding on the road network. And look, this isn't a question about road and rail. I think it's about getting a balance between the two modes. You know, Australia does enjoy some of the most efficient road operations in the world. There's no reason that Australia, particularly here on the East Coast, shouldn't have an aspiration of having a world-class rail system as well, because they will complement each other. So I'm very excited about Inland Rail. It's a project that received a further kick along in the federal government budget this week, and ARTC's been tasked with playing an important role, and we are certainly looking forward to talking to the Minister and the people in New South Wales about getting that project up and running. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you. Minister, of course, getting back to the theme that it's not all about projects, but it's as much about productivity. I was wondering if you could give us an update on other things that the state government's doing on working with industry and with organisations like the Port Botany Operations Group, Optimisation Group, to improve performance. So you gave us a little touch of that in your talk.
Thanks, Patrick. Look, and it builds on some of the things that John was saying about the interaction with road freight and rail freight. PIBLIS, you've often heard me say that Joe Tripodi, it was probably the only good thing he ever did was to put it in when he was the Ports Minister into Port Botany. Well done, Joe. It's worked a treat. We've developed it since then, as we should, and we've made huge gains. It's not helping the fact that I also have a KPI that I wanted to double the freight on rail into Port Botany, that the road's working so well. So you've got to be careful not to lose the gains that you've made out of road. We need to bank the gains that we've made, the productivity going into the port, and enhance the rail freight. And the way we're doing it, I've got a road freight advisory committee with a lot of people from industry that come in and tell me I'm doing something good or not doing something good, and it's frank and fearless advice. And one of the things they said, well, we need to get the top guys in there in a frank situation to go through it. So that's what we're doing. They've got the cards on the table saying this is how we need to do it to get the slots right, get the timing right, improve the loading and unloading, where is the space that isn't being utilised. Let's try and help each other get a better port in that area, because frankly it is to everyone's advantage to get the rail freight to work right. We've got to get planning through on Moorebank. I couldn't agree more with Kerry, and it will be absolutely ideal. So that's where we are at the moment. We've got some of the brightest and the best industry, some of the toughest players in the state who have been in there working with our people in a good way to come up with something to do it better. And as I said earlier in my speech, I've also been dragging my coat around trying to get funding for the duplication, because you've only got to get one crappy loco to break down on that line, and you've banked up all the good operators from Botany out to Bogan Gate, as I said. So we need a duplication so you can actually get around when one of these locos breaks down.
Thank you. And John, perhaps on the same theme around productivity, a lot of it turns on the opportunities presented by technology. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the advanced train management systems and how you're collaborating with industry to deliver that.
Yes, thanks, Patrick. And it's pretty much along the lines that the Minister was talking about a bit earlier, with the technology now being applied to the road network, that you don't necessarily have to build any more infrastructure to make the existing infrastructure work far more effectively in terms of providing more capacity. And so, rail is no different to the road. We're looking at technology now that can allow, basically it's GPS-based technology using telecommunication systems to move trains around our network. The benefit of all of that, of course, it allows, end of the day, to make our whole signalling system redundant, and therefore capacity is not then determined by the spacing of signals on your network. This technology will allow trains to run closer together, to run more flexibly across the network, and that is significant in terms of to be able to operate more trains across those corridors than you would otherwise be able to manage under the existing technology. So it's an exciting development that we've been progressing with Lockheed Martin for a number of years now, where we've just introduced it in a small part of the network in South Australia. We've just conducted stage 1 trials. It's now operating on locomotives. that operate on that corridor, and the plan is by the end of the year to be able to deploy that as the operating system for that part of the network. It was important for us to be able to get it operationally and demonstrate its benefits, and the next step, of course, will be to look at how we can deploy that technology right across the network. I mean, technology is something is very important to the rail industry in terms of being able to extract a lot more capacity, improve flexibility for our customers, and of course to make it a lot safer. And so by the end of this year, I'll be looking forward to being able to demonstrating this as the operating safe working system on a piece of the network in South Australia that will be a basis upon which we could look at rollout on both our interstate network and our network in the Hunter Valley.
Thanks, John. I wonder, Chris and Kerry, I think technology is probably a significant enabler of productivity for you as well. Are you able to reflect on the use of technology and the opportunities for improved productivity from it in your businesses?
At Moorebank, the operator is intending to move to fully automated systems once we get the scale up a little bit. That has lots of benefits, one of which is it's less noisy, and driverless things can operate in the dark, which is also helpful for our surrounding community. But it does mean that we can have a fully automated site and fit in with more automation at the port, and all of this will help more efficient operations all the way along. I should say too that we support the push for duplication that the Minister mentioned, and at the moment on the freight line we can probably carry about 400,000 containers a year. We need to get that up to 1 million, and to do that we need at least a passing loop at Warwick Farm. So there's a whole lot of things along the supply chain that need to be fixed before we even get into being more sophisticated. And I like the picture that the Minister put up of the railway line to Port Botany. It looks like something out of the 1950s. So we really do need to get our act together, I think.
Chris?
I lost a day of my life travelling that line.
Yes. Yes.
Should have been 20 minutes.
Yeah, for Australia Post, we see ourselves as an e-commerce company. The vast majority of the freight that we deliver every day, especially in the parcels side of the business, is generated from an e-commerce online transaction. And we've got a vast network. So you've got, in every suburb, there'll be 8 to 10 posties. In that same postcode, there'll be 4 post vans. There'll be a couple of those red vans that you see around that clear the SPBs, street posting boxes. There'll be several StarTrack vehicles. So technology, and particularly around GPS and being able to really visualise the network and optimise the network, is important to us to improve that efficiency, because there's a lot of latent capacity in those networks. But what we're trying to do actually is use that latent capacity to improve services to customers, because as one of the inhibitors of growth of e-commerce and online trading is the convenience of delivery. So as Uber, I use Uber, but in my suburb in the south of Sydney, if I put my Uber app on, there's no vehicles there. But if you did that with Australia Post, it'd be 10 or 15. So using those vehicles and using that technology to be able to provide greater services to people. Like we can start to deliver to you. If you've got a mobile phone, we don't have to deliver to your house. We can deliver directly to you where you are in your workplace or wherever you are. So technology for us is yes, about creating efficiencies in the network, but also responding to customers, because they're really looking for convenience.
And Chris, you've got about 300 million parcels, is that right, a year that you're delivering?
Yeah.
And it's growing, I presume, exponentially, as it seems to be.
Yeah.
What's really driving that for you?
Well, it's e-commerce. Yeah. So 300 million parcels we'll deliver this year. 70% of them start with an online shopping transaction. And most of that's within Australia. You tend to think that it's coming from overseas, but the vast majority of that is within Australia, and the big retailers are getting more and more online. So that's really driving it. In Australia, only 6% of the total retail transactions are online. So if you go to the US, it's sort of 12 to 15%. If you go to Europe, it's around that 12%. So there's an enormous growth that will happen. I'm sure that will happen. What we've got to do and what we're attempting to do is to really provide speed and convenience. You might have seen we've just done a deal with Qantas for 5 years where they'll run a dedicated freighter network on our behalf. That's really designed to support the e-commerce business and online shopping. The problem we have here in New South Wales is we've got a curfew, so we can operate some smaller aircraft. I'll come back to that in a minute, but if you just think about an e-tailer in Melbourne who has no curfew, and that's where our hub is, where all the flights are leaving Melbourne at 2 o'clock in the morning to go across the country, versus a e-tailer in Sydney, that they'll have to cut off their orders for the next day at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So they're at a tremendous disadvantage versus their colleagues in Melbourne. I can think of two very big e-tailers, Amazon-type Australian versions of that, where the guys in Melbourne are a distinct advantage to the guys in Sydney. So, you know, the aircraft that we can use, and to do it across the country next day, you've got to use air. So we currently have about 200 tonnes a night of that product travelling by air, and we expect that within the life of this 5-year contract to grow significantly. But the problem is we can only fly BA 146s. You may not be familiar, but they're quite an old aircraft. Because it's at night, we fly over the bay, so there's a lot of winds, and those aircraft don't fly very well when it's windy. And they can only take 7 tonnes of our product each. So when you're running a 400-tonne network and you're using aircraft that can only carry 7 tonnes, it simply doesn't work. So that product will go, and that transportation task will go somewhere else. So we just think that possibly, you know, we need to look at more modern aircraft that are just as quiet as a BA 146, but can carry significantly more volume. So I guess that's the issue for us. That e-commerce will continue to drive our business. It'll drive, and the growth of it will be dependent on how fast people can achieve it, the speed and the convenience in which they can achieve it. So our big constraint in that space in New South Wales is that curfew. We need to keep the curfew, I'm sure, but we need to look at the type of aircraft we're using so we can actually give our businesses in New South Wales a level playing field with their Victorian counterparts.
If I can bother you for a little bit more of your time, when you start talking about aircraft like that, I can't help but be recalling articles I've been reading in the papers which talk about the use of drones, obviously at the other end of the freight task. Is this a realistic thing? Are we actually going to move towards a world where drones drop parcels from the sky to us?
Honestly, I have no idea. We've actually trialled drones. We did a trial last month which got some media attention in a closed field down in Dandenong in Victoria. So look, they can work. But to be honest, I'm not quite sure where they'll fit. It's really what the customer is looking for at the end of the day. Potentially they could be an extension to a premium service that we have. It could help us in remote areas where people can't, delivery drivers won't get to. So there's potential uses for drones, but I can't see a day where the sky is blacked out with drones delivering parcels. I can't see that happening. Yeah, no.
Perhaps to bring us back down to earth, Kerry, I wonder, you started touching on this before, but it's obvious that the intermodal terminal needs to sit within a more efficient network, and you started touching on some of the issues that you see. But what really are some of the improvements in the metropolitan network that need to be implemented so that we get the best out of your project?
Well, in terms of Port Botany, moving towards duplication of the line and ensuring the interfaces at the port work smoothly is obviously the direction to go, and we don't have to do that all at once. the passing loop at Warwick Farm really does fix up a lot of the problem in the short term, and I know that John is looking at that. The work that's going on in the industry, where everyone's working together on this, is critical. We've been working with Liverpool, who are our local council, on local road issues, and the roads in that area really haven't had much attention for many decades. And I don't mean in terms of potholes, but I just mean in terms of the very dense traffic that's on there now. That southwest area of Sydney is growing, and over the next 20 years, population the size of Canberra will be there, on top of what's there already. And those of you who travel around in the southwest will know it's very congested already. So that needs to be done, and it gets a little bit back to planning again, Patrick. It was mentioned before, but when these sort of facilities go in, we really need to make sure that we preserve corridors and we preserve buffer zones, so that we could extend Cambridge Avenue out to the M7, but that means preserving a corridor. If we don't do it soon, it's going to be extremely expensive to do it in 5 or 10 years' time. Transurban are looking at how to fix the M5 weave up off the M5 onto the highway. And it's just various small issues of that kind that just need to be addressed. They're not difficult, but a bit of forward planning around those things and strategy would be of great help. Also around the port, I think.
And it's now an opportunity to ask some questions from the floor.
My question today, why is the government stopping bulk commodity coming into Glebe Island, some of the impacts of which will be at least a $500 million impost on the economy, imposing an extraordinary increase in truck congestion coming into the Sydney Basin, down the highways, and a significant increase in construction costs. So what assurance can you give us that the government will continue to allow coexistence of marine activities at Glebe Island?
Thank you, Arthur. What a great question. Those of you that know an internal battle I might be making within the corridors of government would think I set that up, and I've never met you. But look, can I say you make a pretty forceful case? It's one of the hard ones. It's one of the hard ones. It's we talk about a working port, and you almost bring up pictures of people in anoraks watching trains almost. It's not that. It's the fact that this city is going gangbusters at the moment. There are cranes everywhere. And to actually build the city, we are still going to need a place where you bring the concrete in, where you bring the sand in, where you bring the products in to build the city. It's not actually a pretty spot where it happens, but it's an important spot where it happens. Certainly for the next decade or 2 decades, given the work that's happening in the city, we are going to need that important link. Part of the area there is an area for the tourist trade coming in from the ships that are at the overseas passengers terminal or at White Bay 5. But at least part of what's left there for the foreseeable future, we're going to need to bring commodities in to build this city. Those of you that move concrete know that there is a limited amount of time that you can take concrete to the building site. And if we lose all our batching plants around, we're just not going to be able to do it. So it's one thing to have the ideas to build the towers, it's the other thing to be able to do it. Now, having said that, this is potentially an absolutely magic site. It's, the views are terrific, it's waterfront, there is going to be huge development there at the old power station. I think if we do it right, we have an ability to be able to manage both. We need to tidy up where we do our working like things. It's like getting the overalls and washing them once a week or something. So it's, when you come as the tradie into your place, you're actually neat and tidy. So if we tidy it up a bit, we might be able to do a bit of both. It's my job as the Minister for Freight and the Minister for Ports to prosecute that case within Cabinet. There are others that would like to see apartments in that area. And we will look and see what's the best for the city. The economic answer out of that will be done appropriately, and it's not a decision that has been made yet. At this stage, the ability to be able to bring the gypsum, the sand, the cement in remains there and remains there for some time in the future. But I need to be able to do the right thing to make sure that it's locked there to allow us to complete the major building that is happening in the city, that will be happening around Circular Quay, Barangaroo, Bays Precinct into the future.
I think there's a question over here.
Hello there. Question to the panel. My name's Eddie Jansen. I'm from Sydney Airport, and it deals with double stacking on trains. I think over the last 5 or so years there's been some fantastic integration between road, rail and the ports with the expansion of the ports. But the question, and now that I hear that we've got the duplication of the rail line from the port, which is again fantastic, but the issue that I'm looking at is when is it likely to have double stacking from the port through to the intermodals?
Do you want to take that?
I can take that, yes. Yeah. Look, just a couple of things on before I do answer that. On that Port Botany line, it's been touched on by the Minister and by Kerry today, that there's been progressive upgrade of that network to support what we think will be the growth over the next 10 years, and ARTC has invested about $250 million in getting the Port Botany line upgraded. But the two key projects that remain outstanding to really complete the picture, certainly for the next 10 years, is that duplication of the line from Mascot to Port Botany, and also the crossing loop at Warwick Farm to really support the volumes that will come off through the southern part of Sydney, particularly Moorebank. So that's important work. The question around double stacking, we would love to be able to double stack our track into Port Botany, but in all likelihood that will be too cost prohibitive. But what we are looking at the moment is, particularly in association with the inland rail corridor, is to look at to what extent could we double stack into Moorebank at least, because we're outside of the wires, and that's some serious work that we're currently looking at and costing it up to, first of all, understand what are the impediments to it, and then secondly, what would be the cost of doing it, because double stack brings so much benefit. It's no different to a normal truck and a V-double. You just get so much more productivity with each train, and that's something that I think the country still needs to have that ambition to get double stacking as far as you can.
I might take the chairman's privilege and ask one last question, Van. Noticing that at the moment in Canada there are some major bushfires happening, got me thinking about a topic I hadn't really thought about for a couple of years, which is how the freight and indeed our whole infrastructure system adapts to climate change issues. I was wondering, Minister, and perhaps other panellists, if you have a question about how you see us putting in place as systems for adaptation to climate change issues. You're not allowed to thump the table and deny it. You have to adapt to it.
Look, it's embraced in our whole planning and strategy within the state. The planning approvals within the state understand and accept climate change. It is there. whether there are denials or not in the room. It is part we accept, and it is part of history. There has been climate change all through history. It's shown. It's either warming or cooling as we go. At the moment we're in a warming period. We may well go back into a cooling period again, but in our planning we need to accept that it's there, and within local government and within the state planning process it is there.
Well, could I just make one plug? Thanks, Patrick. If you put a tonne of freight on rail, rail uses 1/3, or produces 1/3 the greenhouse gas emissions than road does. So I thought, thanks for giving me an opportunity to plug that.
I'm here
So
for
we can
you.
do our bit for climate change.
I'm here for you, John. Okay, that's about it. So Theo, I understand you're doing the vote of thanks.